There is a small bronze object sitting in a museum case right now, and the card beside it does not tell you what it is. Not because the museum forgot to write a label. Because after 200 years of study, more than 100 of these things pulled from the ground across half of Europe, and every tool modern science has to offer, nobody actually knows. And the closer you look at why nobody knows, the stranger this thing gets. Picture a hollow ball of bronze, about the size of an orange, though some are smaller and some could fill both your hands. It has 12 flat faces, each one a 5-sided pentagon, and at every one of the 20 corners where those faces meet, there's a small round knob, almost like a tiny foot. Cut through the center of each pentagon is a circular hole, but the holes aren't all the same size. One face might have an opening wide enough to fit a finger through, and the face right next to it might barely admit a pencil. There's no obvious pattern to it. You can look straight through the object from a dozen different angles and never quite land on why it was built this way. Archaeologists call it the Roman Dodecahedron, and it shows up almost exclusively in the western and northern reaches of the Old Empire, Britain, France, parts of Germany, and the Low Countries. Since the first one was recognized in the 1700s, well over 100 have turned up, mostly by accident, in fields and riverbanks, and the backfill of old ditches. And in every single case, the questions are the same. What was it for? Who used it? And why, in a civilization that wrote down almost everything, does this object appear in absolutely nothing they left behind? That last point is worth sitting with, because it's the detail that turns this from a curiosity into a genuine puzzle. The Romans were compulsive record keepers. We have their tax ledgers. We have shopping lists scratched onto wooden tablets by soldiers stationed on a cold, muddy frontier. We have detailed manuals on farming, on siege warfare, on aqueduct engineering, on how to properly press olives. If a Roman blacksmith invented a slightly better hinge, there's a decent chance someone wrote it down somewhere. And yet across all of that surviving material, the letters, the inventories, the carved reliefs, the technical treatises, this object is never named, never described, never even sketched in the margin of a page. For an empire this obsessive about documentation, that kind of total silence is not normal. It's almost suspicious. Before getting into what people think it might have meant, it's worth ruling out the boring explanations, because there are a few, and they don't hold up. The first is that these were just decorative trinkets, maybe toys or jewelry, made without any serious purpose. But the level of craftsmanship involved argues against that pretty strongly. Producing a hollow, 12-sided bronze shape, with 20 separate knobs fused cleanly at the corners required a mastery of lost wax casting that most workshops of the time simply didn't have. You'd need a wax model of the entire form, careful control of furnace temperature, and precise metal composition so the bronze would flow into every corner of the mold without cooling too fast and ruining the piece. This was expensive, skilled work. Nobody accidentally makes over 100 of these to the same general standard of difficulty and calls it a toy. The second easy explanation is that they were simple manufacturing mistakes, failed castings that got tossed aside. But again, the sheer number of them, spread across such a wide area, and all built with real care, makes that hard to believe. A mistake doesn't get repeated 100 times across 2 centuries and multiple provinces. So if it wasn't a toy and it wasn't a mistake, what was it? Here's where things get interesting, because for as long as people have been digging these up, there's been no shortage of theories, and each one seems solid right up until you test it against the physical evidence. The oldest theory is that it was some kind of candle holder or lamp. This idea got traction because a few specimens, when examined, showed faint traces of wax residue inside the hollow center. Wax plus a hollow, vented shape seemed to add up to a portable little lantern, with light spilling out through all 12 openings. It's a tidy story. The problem is that a real candle holder needs somewhere for melted wax to collect, and this object has open holes cut into every single face, including where the base would sit. Any melted wax would simply run straight out and pool on the table below. On top of that, if a flame had burned inside one of these things regularly, you'd expect to see soot staining and heat discoloration on the interior bronze. Investigators who looked for exactly that kind of scorching came up empty. The bronze inside is clean. And later analysis of that wax residue suggested it likely soaked in from the surrounding soil over centuries of burial, rather than coming from any candle at all. The lamp theory, for all its appeal, doesn't really survive contact with the evidence. From there, attention shifted to something a little more hands-on, the idea that it was a tool for making gloves, specifically for knitting the fingers. In recent years, people have built replicas, wrapped yarn around the corner knobs, and produced neat little woolen tubes, the kind of shape you'd need for a glove finger. The videos of this are genuinely convincing to watch, and the theory has a nice detail baked in. Different hole diameters could, in principle, produce different tube widths, letting one object make gloves to fit a range of hand sizes. It's a satisfying idea. But it runs into a historical problem almost immediately. The kind of frame knitting shown in those demonstrations wasn't a technique the Romans actually used. Roman textile work relied on null binding, a much older and slower method done with a single blunt needle, no frame required at all. And once again, the physical evidence doesn't cooperate. Yarn dragged repeatedly across a metal edge tends to wear a visible groove into it over time, and wool fibers, being what they are, shed constantly and get caught in crevices. Researchers who examined these objects under magnification looking for exactly that kind of wear and fiber residue found neither. The knobs are smooth, unpolished by handling. The interiors are clean of any trapped fiber. A modern, appealing theory, but not one the objects themselves seem to support. Then there are the more technical theories, the ones that try to place the dodecahedron firmly inside the world of Roman engineering. Maybe it was a surveying instrument, something used to sight distant landmarks and estimate range, with the varying hole sizes acting as a kind of built-in calculation aid. Or maybe it was used to test coins, with holes sized to let genuine currency pass while catching counterfeits or clipped coins. These ideas have a certain dignity to them. They imagine the object as something precise and functional, very much in keeping with how we picture Roman engineering. But they all collapse on the same fundamental issue, standardization. A measuring tool or a coin gauge is only useful if it's built to a fixed, shared standard. And these objects simply aren't. No two dodecahedra share the same overall dimensions, and the hole sizes vary unpredictably even within a single object, with no consistent ratio connecting them. When researchers compared the hole diameters to known Roman coin standards, nothing matched cleanly. You cannot calibrate an instrument that was never made the same way twice. And there's a quieter point that reinforces this. The Romans already had a dedicated surveying tool, called the gromma, a simple cross-shaped sighting device used to lay out their famously straight roads and square military camps. The gromma shows up in technical manuals, in carved reliefs, even on the gravestones of professional surveyors who clearly took pride in their trade. If the dodecahedron had played a similar technical role, you'd expect it to appear somewhere in that same body of evidence. It doesn't. Not once. So what's left, once the toy theory, the casting mistake theory, the lamp theory, the knitting theory, and the measuring instrument theories have all been set aside? This is where the geography of the find sites becomes genuinely revealing, and where the story takes a darker turn. If you plot every known dodecahedron on a map of the Roman Empire, you notice something immediately. They are not spread out evenly the way a common household tool would be. There are none in the city of Rome. None in Italy at all. None in Spain, none in Egypt, none in Syria, none in any of the empire's wealthy administrative centers or major bronze-working cities, the places you'd expect a genuinely useful tool to circulate widely. Instead, every known example clusters tightly along one narrow band, the northern and northwestern frontier of the empire, covering parts of modern Britain, France, and Germany. That's not the pattern you'd see with a practical device. Tools tend to travel toward wealth and craft centers. This is closer to a pattern of boundary, concentrated exactly where Roman civilization met the older Celtic and Germanic cultures it had conquered, but never fully absorbed, peoples whose traditions, unlike Rome's, were passed down through memory and ritual rather than written record. And when you look at exactly where within that frontier zone these objects tend to be found, the picture sharpens further. They don't typically turn up in the middle of busy Roman towns or inside comfortable villas. They are found near burial sites, at river crossings, down old wells, and along the edges where cultivated land gave way to forest. To a Roman surveyor, these might have just been features of the landscape. But in the older spiritual traditions of the Celtic world, places like river crossings and burial grounds carried a different weight entirely. They were often treated as thresholds, spots where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thought to be thin. This is also the point where it's worth being honest about the limits of what we actually know, because a responsible telling of this story has to hold two things at once. The pattern in the archaeological record is real, and it is genuinely suggestive, but no inscription, no priest's account, and no confirmed ritual text has ever surfaced that spells out exactly what these objects meant to the people who buried them. What we have is circumstantial, but it is consistent, and it points in a fairly specific direction. Consider what we know about how Rome treated the older belief systems on that same frontier. Practices associated with divination, ritual, and communication with the dead were not just frowned upon in Roman law, they were criminalized, sometimes with severe penalties attached. And on that same northern and western frontier, where the dodecahedra concentrate, Rome didn't stop at legal prohibition. Roman forces moved directly against local religious leaders, including a documented campaign in Britain against the Druidic priesthood that shocked even some Roman writers with its severity. Rome wasn't simply ignoring these older traditions. In places, it was actively trying to erase them. Put all of that together, and a picture starts to form, not a proven fact, but a genuinely compelling hypothesis. An object this costly and carefully made, showing no wear from practical use, no soot from burning, no polish from repeated handling, found deliberately buried in sealed, undisturbed ground alongside coins and pottery, in places the older local cultures treated as sacred thresholds, on the exact edge of the empire where Rome was actively suppressing those cultures' rituals. That combination doesn't read like an everyday tool that got lost. It reads like something meaningful that was deliberately placed and deliberately left, by people who, for their own safety, could not afford to explain what it was or who used it. That would also account for the silence in the Roman record. If these objects belonged not to Roman engineers or Roman craftsmen, but to a suppressed local tradition operating quietly on the margins of the empire, there would be no reason for it to appear in a Roman ledger, a Roman relief carving, or a Roman soldier's letter home. It simply wouldn't have been part of that world at all. It's important to say plainly that this remains a theory, one among several taken seriously by researchers, not a confirmed answer. Some archaeologists still favor a more mundane explanation, arguing that the object may have had a practical use so obvious and commonplace to the people who made it that nobody thought it was worth writing down, the same way nobody today bothers writing an instruction manual for a coffee mug. Absence of evidence isn't automatically evidence of something hidden. But the pattern here, the craftsmanship, the variation, the total silence in the record, the frontier clustering, the placement near thresholds, and the historical backdrop of Rome actively suppressing local ritual practice in exactly those regions, is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. What we can say with real confidence is this. More than 2,000 years ago, somewhere along the edge of the Roman world, skilled hands poured real time, wealth, and effort into casting these strange bronze cages. They were used for something significant enough that people were willing to bury them intact, unmelted, and carefully placed rather than reused or discarded, the way almost all valuable Roman bronze eventually was. And then, whoever placed them in the ground walked away and never came back. Whatever words were spoken over that bronze, if any were spoken at all, went with them. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you had to place your own bet, do you think this was a sacred object tied to beliefs Rome tried to stamp out, or a completely ordinary tool from a chapter of daily life we've simply lost the thread of? Drop your take in the comments, and if this changed the way you'll look at that little bronze case behind the museum glass, stick around, because the next mystery hiding in plain sight is even stranger than this one.